I was 31 when they found the tumor. Not the age you picture when you hear that sentence. I was working, paying rent, making weekend plans. I had a gym membership I actually used and a group chat with my friends that never went quiet. I was, by every visible measure, fine. And then I wasn't. The scan was a Tuesday. I remember because I had a meeting at 2 that I kept thinking about while the radiologist talked. Isn't that strange? Your entire life pivots in one sentence and your brain is still trying to figure out whether you need to reschedule a Zoom call. The word tumor landed somewhere between my ears and my chest and just stayed there. Heavy, not fully real yet. I drove home alone. I sat in the car park for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. Then I called my mom. She picked up on the third ring. I told her. There was silence, not the kind where someone is processing. The kind where someone is already deciding how much of this they want to carry. She said, "Oh God." Then she said she'd call me back. She didn't call back that evening. She called the next morning, and the first thing she asked was whether I'd told work yet. I want you to hold that detail. Not for sympathy. Just hold it. My dad found out 2 days later. Not from me, from her. He texted. Not called. Texted. For lines. He said it was a shock. He said these things happen to young people more than people realize. He said he was sure the doctors were brilliant. Then a thumbs up emoji. An actual thumbs up. I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and made a cup of tea I didn't drink. Here is what I expected. Not much. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't expecting them to move in. I wasn't expecting my mom to hold my hand through every appointment. I wasn't even expecting daily calls. I'm an adult. I've been largely independent since I was 19. But I did expect, I think any reasonable person would expect, that a tumor diagnosis would make your parents show up in some meaningful way. A visit. A presence. Something that said, you matter more than our discomfort right now. What I got instead is a story I'm going to tell you across the next 40 minutes. And I'm going to tell it exactly as it happened. No softening. No generous reinterpretation of their behavior. Just what they did, what I did, and what I eventually said. 4 words. That stopped my father mid-sentence and left the room so quiet I could hear the neighbor's television through the wall. You might recognize pieces of this story. You might have your own version sitting somewhere in your chest right now. Or you might be listening thinking your family would never. Either way, stay with me. Because this isn't just about a tumor. It's about what happens when the people who were supposed to love you first decide that loving you is inconvenient. And it's about what you do when you finally stop waiting for them to change their minds. The first appointment after the scan was a Friday, 9 a.m. The kind of morning where the sky is flat and gray and the car park is already full, and everyone walking through the hospital doors looks like they'd rather be anywhere else. I've been told to bring someone. It said it right there on the letter. Please bring a support person if possible. I read that line 4 times. Then I drove there alone. I'd asked my mom on the Wednesday. She said she'd try. I knew what try meant. I asked my dad on the Thursday. He said he had something in the morning but could maybe come after. I said the appointment was at 9. He said he'd see what he could do. I stopped asking after that. The waiting room had pale blue chairs bolted to the floor. A water cooler in the corner that made a gurgling sound every few minutes. A woman across from me with her husband's hand wrapped around hers so tight you could see the tension in his knuckles. I looked at the empty seat next to me. Then I looked at my phone. No messages. The consultant's name was Dr. Okafor. She was calm and precise, and she had a way of delivering information like she'd done it 1,000 times but still meant every word. She confirmed the tumor. She told me the location, the size, the type. She used words I'd been Googling at 2 a.m. for a week, so at least I recognized them. She told me we needed to move quickly. She slid a treatment plan across the desk and tapped it twice with her finger. She said, "This is serious, but it is treatable." I nodded. I wrote things down in the Notes app on my phone. My handwriting, if you can call typing handwriting, got worse with every line. She asked if I had questions. I had about 40. I asked 3. The other 37 I couldn't find the shape of yet. I walked out of that office with a folder of information, a follow-up appointment card, and absolutely no one to look at. There's a specific kind of loneliness in that. Not dramatic, not loud, just you've been handed something enormous, and there's no one standing next to you to take even a corner of it. I sat on a bench outside the main entrance. People moved past me with coffees and lanyards and somewhere to be. A porter pushed an empty wheelchair. A child ran ahead of its mother toward the car park. Everyone was in motion. I just sat there. My phone buzzed. I thought for one full second it was one of them. It was a reminder about a dental appointment. I called my best friend Sarah from that bench. She answered immediately. She didn't say much. She just said, "Okay, I'm coming over tonight. What do you need me to bring?" No performance. No processing out loud at my expense. Just, "I'm coming." She showed up that evening with food I didn't ask for and sat with me on the kitchen floor while I finally cried. Not because she said anything particularly wise. Just because she was there. That's the whole thing, isn't it? She was just there. My parents called that evening. My mom first. She asked how it went and I told her and she said it was a lot to take in and she'd need some time to process. I remember thinking, process? You need time to process? I was the one in the room. Then my dad called 20 minutes later and said the same thing, nearly word for word. I wondered if they'd spoken between the two calls. I think they had. Neither of them mentioned coming to visit. Neither of them asked when the treatment started. I didn't bring it up. Not yet. I was still, at that point, giving them the benefit of the doubt. That benefit had an expiry date. And it was coming faster than I knew. When does a parent's excuse stop being an excuse and start being a choice? Treatment started 3 weeks after that Friday appointment. 3 weeks of phone calls that felt like negotiations. 3 weeks of maybe and we'll see and let me check the calendar. 3 weeks of me, a person with a confirmed tumor and a start date for chemotherapy, working around other people's schedules. I stopped noticing when it started. That's the thing about a pattern. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly becomes the weather. My mom had her reasons. She always had reasons. The drive was long, 2 hours, which I'll acknowledge isn't nothing. My dad's back was bad. There was something with the house. A pipe. Then a delivery they needed to be in for. Then a thing with the neighbors that apparently couldn't wait. I wrote none of it down, but I remember all of it. You remember excuses differently to reasons. Reasons have logic. Excuses have a texture. A slight wrongness you can feel before you can name it. My dad called every few days. The calls lasted about 7 minutes. I started timing them without meaning to. He'd ask how I was feeling. I'd say tired or okay or not great, depending on the day. He'd say that made sense. He'd mention something happening at home, the garden, the car, something on television. Then he'd say, "Well, I won't keep you." And he'd hang up. 7 minutes. Consistent as a bus timetable. My mom's calls were longer but emptier. She had a habit of filling silence with questions that didn't want real answers. How are the nurses? Is the hospital clean? Are you eating enough? Yes, Mom, I'm trying, Mom. She never asked the question underneath all the other questions, which was, "Do you need me there?" She never asked because I think she already knew the answer and didn't want to have to say no out loud. Meanwhile, Sarah came every Thursday. My colleague Marcus dropped off a bag of groceries one Monday without knocking. Just left it outside my door with a note that said, "Didn't want to disturb you. Hope this helps." My neighbor Diane, who I'd spoken to maybe 12 times in 2 years, started checking in. Actual checking in. Knocking on the door, looking me in the eye, asking if I needed anything driven anywhere. These people owed me nothing. Let that sit for a second. The first treatment session fell on a Tuesday. I told both my parents the date 2 weeks in advance. My dad said he'd try to come. My mom said she'd see. Tuesday came. I took the bus, sat in the chair, let the nurse fit the line, stared at the ceiling tiles for 3 hours while the drip did what the drip does. The chair next to mine had a woman in it, maybe 60, with her daughter beside her the whole time. The daughter held a book but didn't read it, just sat there, present. I watched them from the corner of my eye and felt something I didn't have a clean word for. Not jealousy exactly. Something quieter. Something that asked a question I didn't want answered. I texted my mom when it was done. She replied 40 minutes later with a heart emoji. My dad didn't respond until the next morning. He said he hoped it hadn't been too rough. I put my phone in my bag and walked to the bus stop and stood in the cold and thought about absolutely nothing for about 4 minutes, which was the closest thing to peace I'd had all week. There was still a part of me making excuses for them. Reframing. Maybe they're scared. Maybe they don't know how to handle this. Maybe showing up isn't how they show love. I gave them every interpretation that let them off the hook. Then came the phone call that took every single one of those interpretations and dismantled them in under 3 minutes. And I haven't been able to rebuild them since. Can you be more afraid of being unloved than of dying? By the third session I had a routine. Up at 6. Toast I didn't taste. Bus at 7:42. Same seat on the upper deck if it was free. Hospital at 8:30. Sign in. Wait. Chair 7 usually. The nurses knew my name by the second week. Nurse Bridget always checked my arm before anything else. Nurse Tom made a specific point of asking what I'd watched on television, not how I was feeling, which was the smartest thing anyone did for me during that entire period. Small talk is mercy. I didn't fully understand that until later. The side effects came in waves. Not all at once, which almost made it worse. Some days were manageable. Some days the fatigue sat on my chest like something physical and immovable. Some days I got to the bathroom floor before I got to the bathroom. I'm not going to detail all of it. You don't need the full inventory. What matters is that I was moving through it, alone, in a flat that had gotten very quiet, measuring time and treatment dates and recovery windows and the small victories of keeping a meal down. My parents knew the schedule. I'd sent it. An actual document. Dates, times, what each session involved. My dad acknowledged it with one line. Thanks for sending this, we'll keep track. We'll keep track. Like it was a project timeline. Like I was a work update he'd circled back to when he had a moment. Week 4 was the hardest physically. I won't dress it up. There was a night around day 3 of that week where I was on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m., and my phone was on the edge of the sink and I thought about calling someone. I went through the list in my head. Sarah was 3 hours away visiting her parents. Marcus worked early shifts. Diane was 70 and I wasn't going to call Diane at 2 a.m. I thought about my mom. I picked up the phone. I put it back down. I already knew how that call would go. I already knew the texture of her panic, how it would become about managing her reaction instead of getting through mine. So I didn't call. I sat on that floor until it passed. Then I got up, brushed my teeth, went back to bed. In the morning I felt something shift. Not dramatically, not a revelation, just a quiet internal adjustment, like a door closing on a room I'd been standing in too long. I stopped waiting for them that morning. I didn't decide it consciously. It just happened the way things happen when your body knows something before your brain will admit it. Sarah came that weekend. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She just walked in, looked at me and said, "You look like you need feeding and a film with no plot." She was right on both counts. We sat on the sofa for 6 hours. She fell asleep before I did. I watched the last hour of something I can't even remember now and felt, for the first time in weeks, like a person rather than a patient. That Sunday evening my dad called. 7 minutes, exactly as usual. He asked how treatment was going. I said it was hard. He said he imagined it must be. He mentioned the garden again, something about the fence. I listened. I said very little. When he said, "Well, I won't keep you," I said okay. I didn't say speak soon. I didn't say love you. I just said okay, and the line went quiet and then it went dead. He didn't notice. That's the part one keep coming back to. He didn't notice that I'd stopped reaching toward him. He just hung up and went back to his evening. And I sat in my quiet flat and understood something I really wish I didn't. The fear of dying had been loud for weeks. But this was a different kind of fear entirely. Slower. Deeper. The kind that doesn't show up on any scan. What's worse, silence or the wrong words? It was a Wednesday. 6 weeks into treatment. I remember the light in the kitchen, late afternoon, that flat yellow that comes through west-facing windows in autumn. I was making soup from a packet because it was the only thing I could manage without standing too long. My phone rang. My dad. Not his usual time. Not his usual pattern. I turned the hob down and answered. He opened normally. Asked how I was. I said tired. He said yes. Then there was a pause. Not his usual transitional pause before the garden update. A different one. Loaded. The kind that means someone has been rehearsing. He said he and Mum had been talking. He said they felt terrible about not being more present. I said nothing. He said it had been hard for them too. Watching from a distance, not knowing what to say, feeling helpless. I stirred the soup. I kept my voice completely level. I said I understood it was hard. He took that as an opening. Then he said it. Calm as anything. He said they decided it was better for everyone if they gave me space to go through this in my own way. That they didn't want to overwhelm me. That they thought I was handling it so well, and seemed so independent that they figured I preferred it this way. That some people need their family around and some people just cope differently. And that they'd always known I was the type to cope on my own. I stopped stirring. I want you to understand what he'd just done. He'd taken their absence, 6 weeks of unanswered need, 7-minute phone calls, heart emojis and thumbs up, and repackaged it as a parenting decision made on my behalf. He'd made their disappearance into a gift they'd given me. Space. Independence. Respect for my process. He said it with complete sincerity. That's what I couldn't get past. He wasn't lying to me. He was lying to himself, and he'd done it so thoroughly he believed every word. My mum was there. I could hear her breathing on the other end, not on the call, in the background. She'd put him on speaker. She was listening and saying nothing, which told me everything about whose idea this conversation had been, and who didn't have the spine to deliver it directly. I said, so this was a choice, not a question, a statement. He said yes, in a manner of speaking, we thought it was best. I said, you chose not to come. He paused. He said, we thought you'd prefer. I said, I sent you the dates. He went quiet. I said, I sat in that chair alone every single time. He said my name. Just my name. The way parents say it when they want you to soften. I didn't soften. I said I needed to go. He said he hoped I wasn't upset. I told him I'd speak to him soon and I ended the call. The soup had gone lukewarm. I poured it down the sink. Stood at the kitchen window for a long time watching nothing in particular. Sarah called 20 minutes later, which she does sometimes on instinct with no reason. I picked up and she said immediately, what happened? I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that is genuinely one of the most extraordinary things I've ever heard. Not comforting. Not that's awful. Just honest. And that honesty was more useful than any amount of sympathy would have been. I didn't cry that night. I think I'd expected this moment on some level, and had been preparing without knowing I was preparing. What I felt instead was a kind of clarity. The sort that's cold and clean and doesn't feel like a gift even though it might be one. I knew now. Exactly where I stood. Exactly what I was working with. And I knew that whenever I came out the other side of this, and I was going to come out the other side, something was going to have to be said. I didn't know what yet. But it was forming. Quietly. The way things form when you stop hoping and start deciding. Have you ever hit a point where surviving felt optional? Week 8. The midpoint. Nobody tells you about the midpoint. Everyone talks about the finish line, when it's over, when you're through, when you can breathe again. Nobody mentions the specific hell of being exactly halfway. Far enough in that you're exhausted down to something deeper than bone. Not far enough out to see the end is real. Week 8 was that place. And it was the worst week of the entire thing. The fatigue by that point wasn't tiredness anymore. It was a full systemic shutdown that started the moment I opened my eyes. I'd lie there in the morning running a calculation. What absolutely cannot be skipped today? Eating made the list. Showering every other day. Everything else was negotiable. I'd stopped returning messages with full sentences. Single words. A thumbs up of my own, which I noticed with no small amount of dark humor. Tuesday of that week I had a low-grade fever that the hospital told me to monitor. I sat on the edge of my bed at 11 at night with a thermometer and a glass of water, and the specific silence of a flat where no one else has been for several days. Not Sarah hasn't visited silence. The other kind. The silence that comes from realizing the people who should be checking on you have decided not to. It has a sound, that silence. A very particular frequency. I opened a new note on my phone. I don't know why. I just started writing. Not to anyone specific at first. Just writing. And then, without planning it, I started writing to my dad. Not the version of him I'd been protecting in my head. The actual one. The one who sent 4 lines and a thumbs up. The one who repackaged his absence as consideration. I wrote things I had never said out loud. I wrote with the kind of honesty that only comes at 11 p.m. with a fever and nothing left to lose. I wrote for 40 minutes. It was not a kind letter. It was not a forgiving one. It was the truest thing I produced in years. When I finished, I read it back once. Then I locked my phone and put it face down on the nightstand. I never sent it. But writing it did something I didn't expect. It took everything that had been circling, the anger, the grief, the disbelief, the love that was still there underneath all of it, making everything worse, and it gave it a shape. A container. It stopped being a fog and became a document. And somehow that made it survivable. The fever broke by morning. I went to session 9 on Thursday. Chair 7. Nurse Bridget. Nurse Tom asked if I'd watched anything good. I said I'd been too tired. He said fair enough and handed me a blanket without being asked. I pulled it up and stared at the ceiling and let the drip do its work. The woman who'd been in the next chair since week 1, I'd never asked her name, we just nodded at each other. A specific nod that requires no explanation if you've been in that room. She wasn't there. Her chair was empty. I looked at it once and then looked away. Some questions you don't ask in that building. I got home that afternoon and there was a voicemail from my mom. She said she'd been thinking about me. She said she hoped this week was better than last. She said to let her know if I needed anything. The last line, "Let me know if you need anything." I'd heard it 12 times by then across 12 different calls. It's the thing people say when they want to appear available without actually being available. It places the labor back on the person already carrying everything. You want help? You have to ask for it. You have to name it. You have to make it easy for me to deliver it. I didn't call back that evening. There was one person who didn't wait for me to ask. Who just showed up, made decisions, took things off my hands without requiring me to direct them. One person who treated me like someone worth the effort of figuring out. And the next week, entirely without warning, that person did something that I still think about when the world feels like it's built entirely of people who are only as reliable as their own convenience. What they did wasn't dramatic. It wasn't expensive. But it arrived at exactly the right moment. And it reminded me, when I'd almost stopped believing it, that showing up for someone is a choice. A daily, deliberate, inconvenient choice. And some people make it. I just hadn't expected it to come from where it did. Why do strangers sometimes love us better than blood? It was a Saturday, week 9. I hadn't made plans because making plans required energy I was rationing carefully. I had a list on my kitchen counter, 3 things I wanted to get done that day. Charge my phone. Eat twice. Open the blinds. That was the full ambition of my Saturday. I was at peace with that. The knock came at 10:30. Not Sarah. She always texted first. Not Diane. She knocked differently, 3 quick taps. This was 2 slow ones. I opened the door and standing there was my Aunt Carol, my dad's younger sister. A woman I saw at Christmas and occasionally at family events and had maybe spoken to one-on-one a handful of times in my entire adult life. She was holding a bag from the supermarket and wearing a coat she hadn't bothered to button, and she looked at me the way people look at you when they've been worried and are trying not to show it. She said, "I hope this is all right. I got your address from Sarah." I stood there for a second. Then I stepped back and let her in. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She didn't do the slow, sympathetic head tilt that I'd come to dread. She walked into my kitchen, put the bag down, looked around once and said, "Right, have you got a decent pan?" I said, "Second cupboard." She opened it, found the pan, started unpacking the bag. I sat at the kitchen table and watched her move around my kitchen like someone who had decided something before she arrived and wasn't looking for permission. She'd brought ingredients. Not ready meals. Actual ingredients. She cooked for an hour while I sat there and we talked not about the tumor, not about treatment, not about how I was coping. She told me about a spectacularly bad date she'd been on 3 weeks prior. She told me about a disagreement she'd had with a colleague. She told me about a book she'd read that she thought was overrated and was suspicious of anyone who claimed to love it. Normal conversation. Ordinary, unremarkable human conversation. I hadn't had that in weeks. At some point, without leading up to it, she said, "I want you to know I'm furious with my brother." She said it the same way she'd said everything else, matter of fact, no performance. I didn't respond immediately. She didn't need me to. She just said it and kept stirring and let it land where it landed. I asked her how she knew. She said she'd called my dad 3 weeks ago to ask how I was doing, and what he'd told her had bothered her enough that she hadn't been able to leave it alone. She didn't repeat what he'd said. I didn't ask. Some details don't need to be transferred. What mattered was that someone in my family had heard the situation from the outside, assessed it clearly, and shown up. Not because I asked. Not because it was convenient. Because it was the right thing. We ate at my kitchen table. She stayed 4 hours. Before she left, she said she'd come back next Saturday if that was okay. I said it was okay. She buttoned her coat in the doorway, looked at me once more with that same direct look, and said, "You're doing better than you think. Not you're so brave. Not I don't know how you do it. Just better than you think." Specific. Accurate. Like she'd actually been paying attention. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. The flat felt different. Not warmer exactly. Just inhabited. Like something had briefly lifted. I thought about my dad. His sister had driven 40 minutes on a Saturday morning because she couldn't leave it alone. He lived 2 hours away and hadn't moved once. Same blood. Completely different decision. I didn't call him that week. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty about it either. I was done spending energy on the guilt. I needed what was left for something more important. Getting through this. Getting out the other side. And eventually saying what needed to be said. The 4 words were getting closer. I could feel them forming. Not with heat anymore. With something colder. More deliberate. More final. Is recovering from family betrayal harder than recovering from illness? The last treatment session was a Thursday. Chair 7. Nurse Bridget taped the line for the final time and said she hoped never to see me again. Which is the best thing a chemo nurse can say to you. Nurse Tom asked what I'd watched lately. I told him. He nodded approvingly. I walked out of that building at 11:30 in the morning into cold air and stood on the pavement and felt not joy. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated. Like putting down a weight you've been carrying so long your arms have forgotten what empty feels like. Carol was waiting in the car park. She'd taken the morning off work. I hadn't asked her to. She just sent a text the night before that said, "I'll be there at 11, don't argue." I didn't argue. We drove to a cafe 20 minutes away, and I ate a full breakfast for the first time in weeks. She talked. I mostly listened. At some point she reached across the table and squeezed my hand once, briefly, and then let go and went back to her coffee. That was it. No speech. No moment. Just a hand and then back to normal. It was exactly enough. My dad called that evening. He knew it was my last session. I'd mentioned it in passing 2 weeks prior, the way you mention things you've stopped expecting people to track. He called at 7. I answered. He said, "Congratulations, that's brilliant news." I said, "Thank you." He said he and Mom were so relieved. I said, "That's good." He asked if I had celebrations planned. I said, "Not really, I was tired." He said, of course, well, you must be exhausted." Then the fence. Apparently now fully repaired. He described it for approximately 90 seconds. I held the phone and looked at the wall. 7 minutes. Same as always. The recovery period is its own particular experience that nobody fully prepares you for. Everyone treats the end of treatment like a finish line. It isn't. It's more like the moment the race ends and you realize both your legs are broken. The body starts its own slow accounting. The fatigue shifts texture. Less acute, more chronic. There are follow-up appointments, scans, Numbers to wait for. A new kind of watching and waiting that sits differently to the old kind but sits just as heavily. I had a checkup 4 weeks post-treatment. Results were moving in the right direction. Dr. Okafor used the word encouraging. I walked out of her office and stood in the corridor and felt the first clean breath of something that might eventually become normal. I texted Sarah immediately. She sent back 17 emojis and a voice note that was mostly her making incoherent noises. I stood in that hospital corridor and laughed for the first time in 3 months. I texted my mom the same news. She replied 2 hours later. She said that was wonderful and that she'd known everything would be fine. I read that twice. She'd known everything would be fine. I thought about the bathroom floor at 2 a.m. I thought about chair 7 week after week with the seat beside me empty. I put my phone in my pocket and walked to the bus stop. My dad didn't text. He called the next morning. Said he'd heard from Mom. Said it was brilliant. Said they'd have to celebrate sometime. Sometime. Loose and dateless, drifting out there in the future like something that might happen if circumstances aligned correctly. I said yes sometime. I matched his vagueness exactly. What I didn't say was that I'd been thinking, clearly, steadily for several weeks now, about what I wanted the next chapter to look like. About which relationships I was carrying out of this and which ones I was leaving behind in that building with the pale blue chairs and the gurgling water cooler. I hadn't made all the decisions yet. But one thing was becoming undeniable. My dad was going to want to return to normal. He was going to show up, physically, eventually, and he was going to behave as though the past 4 months were simply a difficult period everyone had now moved through together. He was going to expect the warmth I'd always defaulted to, the grace I'd always extended, the reset I'd always provided. He was going to be surprised. What do you do when the person who hurt you most shows up smiling like nothing happened? He called on a Sunday 6 weeks after my last session. Not the usual 7-minute call. Longer. He asked how recovery was going, which follow-up appointments I had coming, whether I was eating properly. More questions than he'd asked in the previous 4 months combined. I answered each one. Short. Accurate. Nothing extra. He didn't seem to notice the difference in temperature. He just kept talking, filling the space, and I kept giving him the minimum and he kept accepting it like it was enough. Then he said, "We were thinking of coming down next weekend." I said, "Okay." He said, "Just to see you, see how you're doing, maybe take you for lunch." I said, "Okay." He said, "Does that work for you?" I said, "Yes." He seemed pleased. He said, "Brilliant, they'd sort out the timing and confirm." He said it would be good to see me. I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I won't keep you." I said, "Okay." The line went dead. I sat with my phone in my hand for a moment. Then I put it on the table and went and made tea. Carol came that Thursday. Her regular Saturday visit had quietly shifted to Thursdays over the previous few weeks, working around her schedule. I told her they were coming. She looked at me over her mug with a very specific expression. Not alarm exactly, more like someone watching a weather front move in and calculating how bad it might get. She asked if I was ready. I said I didn't know what ready looked like for this. She said that was probably the most honest answer available. She didn't tell me to be kind. She didn't tell me to hear them out. She just drank her tea and let me have the silence. They arrived Saturday at 12:30. My dad's car pulled up outside and I watched from the window for a moment before going to the door. He looked the same. That was somehow the strangest part. For months of what felt like seismic, irreversible rupture, and he stepped out of that car looking entirely unchanged. Good coat. Hair combed. Carrying a bottle of wine like this was a normal visit. My mom behind him in her usual jacket, looking at the pavement as she walked up the path. I opened the door before they knocked. My dad smiled. The full smile, warm, immediate, the one I'd grown up with. He said, "Look at you." He stepped forward and hugged me. I let him. My mom hugged me after, tighter, longer, not letting go for a beat too many. I stepped back and let them in. They stood in my hallway looking around. My dad said the place looked great. My mom said had I done something different with it. I hadn't. I made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table where Carol and I had eaten lunch every week for months. I put mugs in front of them and sat down and we looked at each other. My dad started talking immediately. He did what I'd expected. He moved straight into the easy version of events, how worried they'd both been, how they'd thought about me constantly, how relieved they were that treatment had gone well. He spoke about it as a shared experience, something they'd all been through together. I sat and listened and kept my face neutral and let him build the narrative. Then he said, "We're just glad you had people around you." I looked at him. He said, "Sarah and that neighbor of yours, it sounded like they were brilliant." I kept looking at him. My mom picked up her mug. My dad maintained the smile, waiting for me to confirm the version of events he just offered. The version where my support network covered for their absence so thoroughly that the absence itself barely registered. The version where everything had worked out fine so nothing needed examining. I set my mug down. He was still smiling, still waiting, comfortable, settled, completely certain of how this visit was going to go. He had no idea what was coming. And honestly, neither did I, not the exact words, not until they were already leaving my mouth. But they were 4 words. And they were ready. Can 4 words carry 10 months of pain, survival, and self-respect? He was still smiling. That's the detail I keep returning to. The smile of a man who had already decided how this afternoon was going to go. Lunch somewhere nearby. Catch up. Maybe a walk. Home by 5. Relationship filed back under normal. He'd done the visit. He'd shown up. In his accounting, that cleared the balance. My mom had both hands around her mug. She was looking at the table. Not at me. At the table. She'd been doing that since they sat down. Small careful glances in my direction and then back to the neutral safety of the wooden surface. She knew. On some level, she absolutely knew that the version of this visit my dad had constructed in his head was not the version that was about to happen. He said again, "Sarah sounded like a rock. And that neighbor Diane, was it?" I said yes. He said, "People surprise you." I said they do. He leaned back slightly, comfortable, nodding, about to move the conversation forward into lunch plans and recovery timelines, and eventually the drive home. I said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Of course." I said, "When you decided to give me space, whose idea was that?" The smile stayed, but something behind it shifted. Micro-adjustment. Eyes fractionally stiller. He said, "We talked about it together, we thought." I said, "I know what you thought. I'm asking whose idea it was first." Silence. My mom's hands tightened around her mug. My dad said, "Does it matter now everything turned out?" I said, "Yes. It matters to me." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said my name. That same parental deployment of my name as a de-escalation tool. Soft. Familiar. Designed to remind me of the relationship before the grievance. Designed to make me soften. I didn't soften. I said I was in that chair every week. Alone. I had a fever at 2 in the morning with no one to call. I sent you the dates. I sent you a document with the dates on it. And you didn't come once. Not once. He opened his mouth. He was going to say the word space. I could see it forming. I said, "Don't." He closed his mouth. The kitchen was completely quiet. Outside a car passed. A door somewhere in the building opened and shut. My mom was completely still. My dad drew a breath. He said, "Sweetheart, we handled it wrong, we can see that now, but we were scared too, we didn't know how to." And that's when I said it. 4 words. Calm. Level. No raised voice. No tremor. Just 4 words placed on the table between us like something I'd been carrying a long distance and had finally decided to set down. I said, "You chose to leave." Not a question. Not an accusation delivered with heat. A statement of fact. Clean and complete. 4 words that did not require his agreement to be true. 4 words that named exactly what had happened without dressing it in psychology or softening it with maybe or framing it as misunderstanding. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't been lost. He hadn't failed to cope. He had looked at a calendar with my treatment dates on it and chosen repeatedly not to move. He didn't speak. My mom made a sound. Not words. Just a sound, small and compressed like something escaping. My dad looked at me. The smile was completely gone now. What replaced it was harder to read. Not anger, not defensiveness. Something more uncomfortable than both of those. The particular expression of a person who has just heard a true thing they cannot immediately dismantle. He said my name again. Quieter this time. Picked up my mug. I took a sip of coffee. I looked at him steadily and waited. Not to be cruel. Not to perform strength. Just because there was nothing left to add. The 4 words had said everything. Whatever came next was his. The silence lasted a very long time. Does saying the hard thing out loud set you free, or just set you apart? He didn't respond for a long time. Not seconds. Long enough that the refrigerator hum became audible. Long enough that my mom shifted in her chair. Long enough that I finished my coffee and set the mug down without filling the silence myself, which 6 months ago I would have done automatically. That instinct to smooth, to rescue, to make the discomfort stop was simply gone. I didn't miss it. My dad finally spoke. He said, "That's not fair." I said, "Okay." He said, "We were scared. We didn't know what to do. That doesn't make us bad parents." I said, "I didn't say it did." He said, "It felt like you did." I said you chose to leave. That's what happened." He pushed back from the table slightly. Not standing up, just creating distance, the physical language of a man retreating into position. He said they'd called. They'd checked in. They'd been there in every way they could manage. I let him list it. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I said, "I know." And it wasn't enough. My mom spoke for the first time. She said, "We didn't realize how bad it was." I looked at her. I said, "I told you." She said, "You always seemed like you were coping." I said, "I was coping because I had no other option." She looked back at the table. My dad rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture I recognized from childhood, the physical signal that he'd reached the edge of what he could process. He used to do it before big arguments when I was a teenager. It meant he was about to either escalate or shut down. He shut down. He said, "I don't know what you want from us." I said, "I don't want anything from you right now. I just needed you to hear that." That landed differently to everything else. I watched it reach him. His shoulders dropped slightly. The defensiveness didn't disappear, but it lost some of its structure. He sat there looking at the kitchen table, and I sat there looking at him, and my mom sat between us looking at her hands, and the 3 of us existed in that silence together for the first time in the whole sorry stretch of months without anyone performing anything. They didn't stay for lunch. My dad stood up after a few minutes and said he thought they should probably head off. "Give me some rest." I said okay. My mom hugged me at the door, the same tight hold as when they arrived, but different now, less performance, more apology. She didn't say sorry out loud. It was in the grip. I acknowledged it and let her go. My dad stood on the doorstep. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "I hear you." 2 words. Small. Nowhere near sufficient. But real, I think. The first real thing he'd offered all afternoon. I nodded. He nodded. He walked to the car. I closed the door and stood in the hallway. Same spot I'd stood when Carol left that first Saturday. The flat had the same quality of silence. Not empty, just settled. Like something had been resolved that had been unresolved for a very long time. The phone calls started 3 days later. First my Aunt Linda, my mom's sister, who'd apparently heard a version of events and wanted me to understand that my parents had found it very difficult and were deeply hurt. I listened. I said I understood. I didn't explain myself. I didn't defend the 4 words. They didn't require defending. Then a cousin. Then a family friend who'd known my parents for 30 years and felt compelled to offer context about their generation and how they expressed love differently. I thanked him for calling. I said I appreciated his perspective. I did not change my mind. Sarah called that same week. I told her everything. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it genuinely before answering. I said, "Like I told the truth and the truth had consequences and I'm okay with both of those things." She said, "That's the most grown-up sentence you've ever said to me." I laughed. First real laugh in days. Carol came Thursday. I told her how it had gone. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I finished, she said, "Good. Just that. Good." Then she asked if I wanted pasta and I said yes, and she went to the cupboard and that was that. My dad didn't call for 11 days. When he did, his voice was quieter than usual. Different texture. Something had shifted in him. Not resolved, not repaired, but moved. Like a bone that's been reset and is now doing the slow work of healing in the correct position instead of the wrong one. It wasn't fixed. It wasn't going to be fixed quickly or cleanly or in the way families in films fix things, with speeches and embraces and a score underneath. This was the real version. Slower. Messier. Uncertain at the edges. But the silence between us was different now. It had been named. And named things, however painful, are always easier to navigate than the ones you're all pretending aren't there. What does surviving teach you that living never could? 6 months after that Saturday, I'm sitting at the same kitchen table. Different light, spring now, not autumn. The mugs are the same. The refrigerator still hums. Some things stay constant regardless of what happens around them. I find that either comforting or absurd depending on the day. The scans came back clean. Dr. Okafor used the word excellent. I sat in her office and nodded and said thank you and walked out into the corridor and didn't call my parents first. Called Sarah. Then Carol. Then I bought myself a coffee from the hospital cafe and sat by the window and drank it alone, which sounds sad and wasn't. It was the first genuinely peaceful alone I'd experienced in over a year. There's a difference between alone because no one came in alone because you chose it. I know that difference now in my body, not just my head. My dad and I speak every week. The calls are longer than 7 minutes. Not dramatically, sometimes 8, sometimes 15. But the fence doesn't come up anymore. He asks real questions and waits for real answers. Last month he asked if he could come to my next checkup. Not offered. Asked. I said yes. He came. He sat in the waiting room while I was with Dr. Okafor, and when I came out he was in one of the pale blue chairs with his coat still on and a coffee he'd barely touched, and he stood up immediately when he saw me. I told him the results. He didn't say he knew it would be fine. He just said, "I'm glad I'm here." That was enough. Not everything, but enough. My mom is slower. She operates in the language of deflection and always has. She'll unlearn it partially eventually or she won't. I've stopped making her timeline my problem. We talk. It's careful. There are things we don't say directly that we both know are there. That might be how it stays. I've made my peace with a partial peace. Not every relationship gets fully repaired. Some just get adjusted, repositioned, maintained at a different distance with a different set of expectations. Carol still comes on Thursdays. We don't talk about what she did anymore. It's just Thursday now, which is exactly right. Here's what I want to say to you directly. Not a lesson, not a framework. Just the truth of what I know now that I didn't know before. If you are in the middle of something hard and the people who were supposed to show up haven't, I want you to hear this. Their absence is not a verdict on your worth. It is information about their capacity. Those are two completely different things, and it took me a long time to stop confusing them. The 4 words "you chose to leave" were not the most powerful thing I did during those 10 months. They were the most visible, the most dramatic, the moment the video title points to. But they were only possible because of everything that came before them. Every morning I got up anyway. Every treatment session I walked into alone. Every 2 a.m. on the bathroom floor that I survived without calling someone who wouldn't have known what to say. Every meal Sarah brought that I actually ate. Every Thursday with Carol. Every small deliberate act of continuing. That's the thing that doesn't fit neatly into 4 words. The survival wasn't in the confrontation. The confrontation was just the moment I proved to myself that the survival had already happened. That I'd already become someone who told the truth even when the truth was expensive. Someone who'd stopped managing other people's comfort at the cost of her own reality. I am not who I was the Tuesday before the scan. I don't think I'm supposed to be. I'm quieter in some ways. More selective. I know who showed up and I know who didn't, and that knowledge sits in me permanently now. Not as bitterness, just as data. Clean and indelible. The pale blue chairs are still there. Someone is sitting in chair 7 right now. Maybe alone. Maybe terrified. Maybe already doing the slow internal arithmetic of who in their life is actually going to move. I think about that person more than I expect to. I hope someone brings them a blanket without being asked. I hope someone shows up on a Saturday with a bag of groceries and a story about a bad date. I hope someone sits across from them on a kitchen floor and just stays. And if none of that happens, I hope they find what I found. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. That place inside you that nobody's absence can actually reach. The part that was never waiting for permission to survive. You get through it. Not because someone came. Sometimes because you did.